Hi everyone, welcome. Very first webinar of 2019. Can I do the usual sound check first, just to make sure that you're hearing me, seeing me, and that all is well? Are you hearing me? Over. Hearing you fine, says Richard. Well, that's a good start, Richard. Oops, have I not switched on my camera? Hang on a second. Mind you, I should probably leave it off, given that I'm struggling with a bloody cold today, but can I just check that you're seeing me okay? Okay, hang on there a second. So, how are we doing? Your camera was switched off. Camera on, thank you, Chris. Is it just Chris or can everyone see it? Thanks, Gail. Brilliant. Okay, mind you, I'll probably regret putting the camera on. I've been flying a lot in the last week, so I'm wedded to the tissue today. If that gets out of hand, I may well switch the camera off before we go much further. Anyway, we're not here to talk about my cold. We're here to talk about how we value ourselves. The subject of today is gaining a bit of clarity on how we value ourselves and how we value our work. I'll be keeping an eye down here on the question log, so feel free to jump in as we go and raise any issues or comments that are particularly relevant to you. Let's make a start. Why would we begin with this? Of all the things we might have began with at Self-Worth Academy, why are we starting with this how we value ourselves thing? I mean, with all the uncertainty out there in the marketplace, surely there's something more important to talk about. Well, yes and no. The way in which we talk to ourselves is the foundation for our confidence and self-esteem. It's particularly important when we're facing setbacks, because that's the time that we need to be energized. That's the time that we need to feel good about ourselves, if you like. It helps us also to get purpose and direction. And even if we're going through times where that purpose and direction is not very clear, then a sense of value and a sense of friendship with ourselves helps us during those transitions. It certainly helps with decision making. It helps us to say yes and no, to have clarity about what we're saying yes and no to and why. And definitely for anyone who has to charge fees or negotiate remuneration, having a sense of value in oneself is the very foundation of doing higher value work. Any other reasons, apart from the things I've already mentioned? Why are you here? Well, what's your interest in defining your value, apart from any of the things I've already mentioned? In what context would you like to have a greater sense of your own value? I'm watching the question box or the chat box. Thanks, Judith. For many people, it helps us to demonstrate and to match our values with the values of the people we're working with or working for, as the case may be. Karen talked about public speaking. Very, very true. As somebody who went through a lot of angst around that at a certain point in my life, a very long point in my life, I really relate to that. The sense in which the way in which we value ourselves has a lot to do with our willingness to get out of that comfort zone. In family life, great point from Elizabeth. You know, the way in which we're, the sense, our relationship with ourselves doesn't just transform our work life. It has a lot to do with how we are friends with people, and it has a lot to do with relationships and family. Not the subject particularly of today, though you'll easily see how some of the skills transfer. I will come back to some of the other points that's made here. Just to say, Kerry has alluded to the general value in society. This is particularly important, I find, with younger professionals at the moment, where a lot of self-questioning and a lot of self-introspection is actually creating a consequential anxiety and insecurity. And one of the reasons for forming Self-Worth Academy is to start to deal with that challenge. Okay, thanks for the comments, everyone. We could do a whole webinar on that subject alone. Today, there's three parts. First and foremost, I'm going to talk a little bit for about 15 minutes or so on some of the typical ways that people value themselves and some of the pitfalls or some of the limitations that might give rise to. We're going to look at a key shift in thinking, and those of you who've been following Self-Worth Academy have a pretty good idea of what that is. And the third part, which is brand new, we've never done this before for anyone who's in these webinars, we're going to look at some of the practical examples of the impact this makes. We're going to look at two situations in particular. So what are some of the common problems? Well, I've been coaching for 18 years now, soon to be 19. The recurring issues around self-worth, self-esteem, call it whatever you will, is often that people feel pulled in different directions. It very often is a lack of confidence in how we talk about ourselves, or consequentially talking too much about ourselves, which is almost the two extremes, if you like, of that. Just bear with me 1 second. I just want to check something with my team here. Can we check, Madeleine, this has been recorded? I'm not sure that it is. That we may find ourselves seeking validation and approval when we ought not to be, when we kind of know we don't need it, but yet we somehow need approval, we somehow need validation. We find ourselves responding to random opportunities, saying yes to things without really knowing why we're saying yes to things. We may, if we're unlucky, find that we're being exploited or feeling we're being exploited, which in terms of the impact on us is pretty much the same thing. We may experience difficulty making decisions. It's one of the issues that I've had a number of times in my life, which is just, lying awake at night, not knowing whether to turn left or to turn right. And I could carry on. Nearly all of these things produce ups and downs in energy levels. And one of the recurring issues that often happens with when we're not sure of our own value is that energy fluctuates. On certain days we feel good, and we wonder what was the problem yesterday, and then lo and behold, next week we're back in a state of depression or anxiety, as the case may be. And the problem with proving ourselves is threefold. First and foremost, in many cases, we just don't need to. And if you've ever been on the receiving end of somebody proving themselves, you'll see this it will be very evident to you that they're proving something to you they don't need to prove. This can be true in friendship, by the way, or in relationships, just as much as it can be true in work. Secondly, and the part we're going to focus a lot on today, is we're often less impactful when we're talking about ourselves, even when we're doing so fluently. Much of the time, as we'll demonstrate later, the value of what we do is hidden when we're talking about ourselves. And the shift we'll be looking at today is to actually build that bridge from a different bank of the river. And thirdly, there's this constant knowing anxiety about not measuring up to our full potential. Now, if you've been watching the likes of Brené Brown and others, you'll be familiar with the term imposter syndrome. Imposter syndrome is a term that's been around since the late 70s. And interestingly, it's suffered by very successful people. Imposter syndrome isn't so much suffered by average achievers. On the contrary, it's associated with people who have done really well in the arts, in theatre, in business. People like Sheryl Sandberg, who is very well known, owns up quite publicly to imposter syndrome. So do many actors and actresses. Natalie Portman springs to mind. Many people have publicly come out as feeling almost a sense of being a fraud. And yet, any of us would regard them as being outstandingly successful. And this thing about having to prove ourselves writes a blank check for anxiety. So let's just get clear about language first and foremost. When I use these terms, I don't want to spend a lot of time on terminology because I hate this kind of academic discourse myself, but it's important we get clear about the terms that we're using. Confidence. These three words are often used interchangeably, but I'm going to go through them one by one. Confidence is how we present ourselves to the world. It can be real, it can be faked. If we're fortunate, then it's real. But many of us can think of situations where we faked confidence, where others might not have seen the true dialogue that was going on inside our heads. Self-esteem is more about the reputation that we have with ourselves, to use Nathaniel Branden's definition. It's the sense you have of yourself even when nobody's watching. And we often do things to measure up to our own expectations. Self-worth is intrinsic. It is not dependent on whether we're winning or losing at the game of life. It's an unconditional sense of your own worth and of loyalty to yourself, no matter how you are performing or achieving, or whether you've been successful yesterday, or whether you're in love or not, or whether you are in any way measuring up, even to your own expectations. And the problem we have is, first of all, we're in a culture that uses these three terms interchangeably as if they were the same thing. And secondly, we have a culture that for a long time now, at least 2 generations, has been focusing on self-esteem. And this has created a legacy of narcissism, self-preoccupation, which is finding, many are noticing, particularly in education now, that this is particularly rampant amongst people who are born around the millennium or after. And the effects of that show up in different ways for different people. So some have their problems in the workplace. Others struggle more in relationships. Some struggle to sleep. One of the growth problems, if you like, is this world in which many people are really having difficulty getting a decent night's sleep. If you've been following the likes of Harari, who has written books on Homo sapiens and Homo Deus, the recent, there's also a recent one that I haven't read yet, but he says in one of those books that we're losing the battle on happiness. We might be winning the battle on other things. We might be winning the battle on with diseases. We might be winning the battle with food availability. Apparently, we are. Still surprises me, but apparently there are fewer people dying of starvation than there were a century ago. However, he claims we're losing the battle on happiness. And this is definitely linked to this rise of narcissism and self-preoccupation. In which area would you like to make a change? You know, if you were to pick a context in which you would like things to be different, would it be how you are in meetings? Would it be with how you are at home? Would it be how you behave in relationships? Would it be something to do with your career direction? What for you, in what area of life would you like to make a change? You don't have to tell us what the change is, but it would be really helpful if we take a minute to just identify where would you like to make a change. This gives me a moment to check the chat box. To learn how to forgive myself. What a great, isn't that a marvelous line? To learn how to forgive myself. Wow, there's so much that could be said about that, Mercy. I don't know where to start. Career direction. Wow, we're getting them coming thick and fast now. Lots of career direction, I see. Career direction. Hey guys, we need to do one on career direction, don't we? Okay, job hunting, yep. Meetings. Okay. Wow. Right, I can see that I will have to sit down and read these more carefully. Hopefully you're all seeing everybody's comments. I think we set the webinar up that way so that everybody's seeing everybody's comments. So I'm hoping you are seeing influencing skills. Actually, this is we're going right there. Without further ado, let me keep going. Okay. Little bit more by way of background. We get to skills, but I don't want to plow into skills without building some self-awareness first. Otherwise, sometimes we're just confirming ourselves in the same old struggle. So I'd like us to actually just spend a little bit more time on understanding, and I promise we will get to the practical stuff. fairly crude generalization here. I've taken this diagram from the book Coming Up the Self-Worth Safari. Essentially, there's four different ways, or there's four different styles in which people present themselves. And it largely depends on whether their self-worth is high or low, as per the diagram in front of you, and or whether your orientation is towards oneself or towards others. So if we start with this corner, because it's the easiest one to talk about, these are people who have low self-worth, and therefore there's an emptiness inside, and their orientation is towards themselves and how they're coming across. For them, social media has written a blank check for them to be doing hourly selfies and expecting lots of people to follow their every move and what they've just had for breakfast. This is classic narcissism, and one of the worries in the psychology space at the moment is the rise of narcissism. It's particularly rampant in that quadrant where self-worth is low and people's orientation is towards themselves. The second one is perhaps less obvious, but as somebody who spent many years working in non-profits, in charities, and involved around the giving space, shall we say, you will come across there the phenomenon of the needy helper. If you know them, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Yes, their orientation is towards others, and they're always giving and solving problems, but you just sense the craving for validation inside, the hole in the Easter egg, if you like, that continually craves more chocolate. So this is the needy helper. Again, they're of low self-worth, though their orientation is towards other people rather than towards themselves. I realize when I point in that direction, you're probably seeing the diagram in that direction. I can't even work this out, but it's, you know what I mean. The next group, which you come across a lot in corporates, a lot in business, is the performer. So the performer has perhaps a greater degree of self-assurance. They may well have a high degree of genuine intrinsic self-worth. However, their orientation is towards themselves. So their preoccupation is with themselves and how they're coming across. They talk about my team rather than our team. They talk about what I've done rather than what we've done. They talk a lot. I saw a funny cartoon recently on this. I wish I could remember the lines. I'll put it in the next webinar. And the quadrant that most interests us here at Self-Worth Academy is, of course, where self-worth is high and where the orientation is towards others. These are the people who have the most impact. Why? Because they have sufficient self-worth to have impact and to make a contribution, but their interest is in is in the benefits that they bring to others or the risks that they reduce for others. And by and large, the way in which we have more impact and the way in which we have a better relationship with ourselves is by moving as close as we can get into this quadrant. Though the challenges are different for different people. For the needy helper, it's maybe about suspending a little bit the service activities for a while and actually concentrating on being a friend to themselves. So, i.e., growing in self-worth. For the narcissism, it's a twofold challenge, and for them, it can be hard to make the change. In fact, if you have a narcissist in your life, you know just how hard it is to deal with that. For the performer, and I'm hoping we have a few on the call, for the performer, it's the discovery that you can be an even more effective performer by talking about yourself as a contributor. And we're going to rehearse that skill today, and even more in the next webinar when we talk about how we introduce ourselves. So let's get practical. We've invented a little character here called Melanie. There's Melanie. Notice Melanie is hiding a little bit. Melanie perhaps has a bit of a self-worth challenge going on. You can make Melanie male or female. You can invent her as a coach or a consultant or a web designer or whatever works for you. But if we listen to Melanie talk about herself, she will probably talk about her background or her education. We will, there's a few technical questions coming in that I understand Madeleine is dealing with. Good. Melanie will probably talk about her background or education. She will probably talk about her job experience or her achievements, because that's kind of the next thing that people talk about as soon as they have some. She quite often these days will talk about her philosophy of life or her beliefs or her values, because there's been a great rise in that discourse over the last 10 to 20 years. She may well, depending on the field she's in, talk about her approach or her methodology or how she's working. Question for you, what's the common denominator between all of those different things? When Melanie talks about her background in education, when she talks about her philosophy of life and her job experience and her achievement and her methodology, absolutely, as Inge has just described, as Judith has just described, as you're all just realizing, the common denominator in all of this is it's Melanie talking about Melanie. And that's the issue. And that's the betrayal, if you like, of the lack of self-worth. Because if Melanie had a bit more self-worth, she wouldn't need to. This is one of the subtle differences between self-worth and self-esteem. And that takes us straight to the key shift in thinking, right on cue, 20 minutes in, that we want to get to. We want to shift we want to encourage Melanie to shift from a self-esteem thinking to a self-worth thinking. So self-esteem, as we jocularly put it around here, self-esteem is walking down the street as if you owned it, at least on a good day. Self-worth is walking down the street and you really don't care who owns it, because it doesn't matter. You may still have aspirations to own a street, that's not the point, but you do it as an expression of self-worth rather than a condition of self-esteem. It totally changes the way in which you walk down that street, or any street. And that's essentially the core of the book that's coming up. I'd love to give you the launch date, but somewhere in March, somewhere between the 7th and the 21st. And that entire book is about developing an unconditional friendship with yourself, moving from self-worth to self-esteem, so that you can walk down that street and live and work on that street with a completely different mindset. And the benefits of that, I could go on about all day. I'm just going to focus on 5 for the purpose of today's topic, which is how we think about our value. Number 1, you're going to be far more impactful in your communication. So if your interest is in influencing others, if your interest is in getting more business, if your interest is in a new career direction, or even finding what your career direction should be, then from a self-worth perspective, this changes the way you talk about yourself. Secondly, you don't have to prove anything. You already have self-worth. It's a friendship with yourself that's independent of performance. And therefore, it doesn't matter how you perform or even how you feel. You might still lack confidence. You might even lack self-esteem. You might be doing things you're not particularly proud of. It doesn't matter. You can still have self-worth even while you're eating that bag of chips. Thirdly, you recover more quickly from setbacks and disappointments because you don't have that extra burden of self-reproach that self-esteem thinking creates as a legacy. And as a result, because you're recovering quickly and because you're more impactful in your communication, you gain trust. Why? Because people have a sixth sense of whether your interest is in them rather than in yourself. Honestly, I don't know how this works. It's almost as if the chemistry in the air around us carries the difference. And as a result of all of the above, of course, you become more productive. Of course, you value your time, which starts a sort of positive spiral around all of the other things. So, one of the things we said we were going to do today is to talk about some of the ways. Now, I've just written a book about it, so I cannot cover a book in one slide. But just to give you a flavor, number 1, detach your sense of self-worth from your performance or your background or your results. You know, your friendship with yourself does not depend on, or does not have to depend on, any of those things. Secondly, very important one, stop the self-assessments, even the positive ones. You know, I had this discussion with a friend yesterday. These lovely affirmations like I am smart, I am intelligent, I am beautiful. Yes, they're nice, and it's a bit like a sugar diet. You know, it gives us that short-term lift in energy. However, the habit of self-appraisal in the end is is the problem. We need to stop some of these self-assessments. We're killing ourselves with these adjectives. What we want to do is to start unconditionally valuing ourselves, even on days those adjectives are not very good. Thirdly, find your statement of that. Now, my favorite one, whether I'm eating a delicious chocolate cake or I was in Brussels yesterday and I enjoyed a lovely meeting where they had a delicious tarte au sucre. Trust me, I had 2 hefty slices of it. Why? Because I love tarte au sucre and I'm happy to enjoy every bite of it. So whether you are out running at the weekend working off the tarte au sucre, or whether you are enjoying the tarte au sucre, in both cases, you want to enjoy it. You want to do things because you're worth it. You want to feel that you are enough. And find a physical action that goes with that. One of my favorites is right here beside me. It's never far away. It's a drink of water. Why? Because when we take a physical action as an expression of self-worth, it shifts it from the brain into the body. Let me just avail of that. This isn't just about energy. This isn't just about performance. It's literally watering self-worth. And for some, that might be going for a walk. I mean, there's no shortage of actions. I worked with a lady who has this lovely Power of Now walk. So she goes for a walk, and on the walk, she enjoys the experience of walking, rather than just rehearsing what she's going to do when she gets back to work. So finding a physical action that's an expression of self-worth is very powerful. And here's the very important shift for today. There are 7 shifts in total in the book. This is number 7, shifting from being interesting, or trying to be interesting, to being interested. Very powerful shift, both in personal relationships, but also, for that matter, in work. Kathy says, how you value yourself is heavily embedded in your beliefs, indeed. Hardwired from childhood. So very true. Kathy, that's such a big topic. I cannot take the lead off it. In asking the question, I'm sure you're well aware of just how big a topic it is. They are indeed hardwired from childhood. I will just say that any of us can reparent ourselves, no matter what's happened. You know, I've worked with people who have been through trauma. I've worked with people who have had childhoods that really are not ideal. And yet, in a relatively short period of time, this distinction between self-worth and self-esteem helps to illuminate things, not always to solve problems, but helps to shed light on days that otherwise can be quite shadowy. This is a particularly powerful message for overachievers. Let me stay with the imposter syndrome, which is the suffering that overachievers often have. The problem with the overachievement is that the overachievement tends to create its own anxiety, because we become we start to condition ourselves on the achievement. I'm just checking in on the sound. Paul is having trouble with sound. Can I check that everybody else can hear me? Okay, thanks, Richard. I see, I need the odd bit of external validation, at least for practical reasons. My self-worth was not impacted during that moment, but I did have a moment of anxiety. Maybe I am an overachiever. Secondly, it's energizing. It's energizing because in removing the anxiety, then that energy is available to do what the overachievers quite naturally do. Thirdly, and because of the above, it enhances their performance. Now, overachievers are already pretty good at this. What this does is it makes the performance more consistent, because many overachievers do wonderful work for 2 weeks in a row, and then they're off work for 3 days because they're burned out. What self-worth does is it evens out those slumps, if you like. And as a result of more reliability, and as a result of being more interested in others rather than in their own performance, it enhances their connection with others. Many overachievers suffer from a sense of isolation. And that's not an accident, because their preoccupation with their own performance and their own achievement and are they enough diminishes their availability to others, both in relationships and in a work setting. Part 3, let's look at some practical examples of this impact, and I've been impatient to get to this point, if you like, quickly checking in that all is well on the slides. Good. So here's, remember Melanie? We talked about Melanie in the beginning. You're probably wondering, where's Melanie? Where'd she go? I know she's self-effacing, but she seems to have disappeared. The shift that we're bringing about from Melanie is from proving herself to what? Before I set the slide, what's the shift that we want to bring about for Melanie? Accepting, being, liking, living. Go on, let's have some more. This has been very valuable research for later. We'll be saving this chat, right? Won't we? We will. 2 friends here to help. Accepting is a big part of it, but most importantly, we want Melanie valuing herself. Accepting is part of that. You clearly cannot value yourself without accepting yourself. But we really want Melanie valuing herself as she is already. In that case, she's got nothing to prove. And if she doesn't have anything to prove, she's going to go into that meeting, or she's going to go into that leadership conference, or she's going to go to that client or that prospective employer with a completely different mindset. Or that social event, by the way. It's not just work. Okay, what does that mean? It means, first and foremost, that because she's already okay, she doesn't need to talk about herself at all. We're not trying to get her to stop talking about herself because that's not interesting. We're actually going, Melanie, you're fine. You don't need to talk about yourself. You're free to talk about the needs and the challenges of the people you want to serve, or the people you're curious about if you're in transition. And therefore, you don't need to go into all that background bio stuff. It will allow you, when you do talk about yourself, if you ever do, because it's amazing all the jobs you can get and all the assignments you can win without ever talking about yourself at all. It will allow you to position yourself better in the context of that discussion. And by dropping all those self-preoccupied stories, you will be better able to contribute to any objective around you, whether it's social or whether it's professional. So let's imagine, for a moment, reaching for my water, where'd I put it? Let's imagine that Melanie is a career coach. Now, she could be a web designer. She could be any one of 100 different occupations, either employed or self-employed. In this case, it doesn't matter. But let's imagine she's a career coach, because many people on this call will know the world of coaching. Magnus, great to see you. If you want to be an interesting person, make people talk about themselves. How could I? Couldn't put it better than that. If Melanie is a career coach, then she will probably say things like this. Notice she's not going to talk about herself. She's going to talk about the people she's working with. So she might say, you know how many people who are in transition in their careers are in fact in search of meaningful work. And during that transition, life can be rather hard for them, because first of all, there's many jobs around, might be interesting, but they're not particularly meaningful. And they may also try some of these jobs or roles and find they're not all they're cracked up to be, that very often the job spec and the job reality is rather different. As a result of which they become depressed, they become discouraged, they become de-energized, and sometimes they start to lose faith not only in themselves, but actually in the world of work. So when I work with them, I help them to work on their identity and not just their career. Sorry, Karen, I couldn't help seeing that. Oh my God, you're describing me. I wasn't trying to. Okay. Melanie could become Karen, be careful. During that transition, I help them, notice we're talking about them, I help them to work on their identity and not just on their career. As a result of which, they become re-energized by what they're trying to bring about. They are able to be more effective in meetings. They are able to maintain self-worth even on those days that things are not going for them. So that even if that next job or that next meeting or that next whatever doesn't work out or is different to what they expect, their identity is still intact. The roots of their life remain firmly planted even in the frost. Now, as you can tell, I was improvising there, but you get the idea. We can have an amazing conversation with anybody without ever talking about ourselves. Precisely what Magnus wrote a moment ago. If you want to be an interesting person, make people talk about themselves. Absolutely right. So, in summary, what's Melanie doing? She's talking about their situation. She's talking about the issues that this situation creates for them. She's talking about the ripple effects of these problems. She's describing rather succinctly, not in a lot of detail, not without a load of methodology and theory and reference to books and TED Talks and all that stuff, but quite succinctly, she's describing a shift or an approach that she stands for in the world. She's then talking about the impact this has for them. She's talking about the ripple effects of these benefits. And then maybe Melanie can tell a story. And hopefully the story she tells won't be about her trip to India, but will be a story about one of them rather than about herself. See where self-worth is a complete game changer in how we, in the narrative, in the story that we build in the world. And by the way, that's just as true socially or at a party as it is in the workplace or in a meeting. Comments, observations about that? You still there? Anyone out there? Me too, says Tony. Me too. So I'm hoping you're starting to think like, how does this apply to me? I recommend that template, but we'll send you the slides and the recording and all that stuff probably tomorrow. Maybe make it Friday. Let me set let me overachieve on the deadline. Let's aim for Friday, which means you'll have it tomorrow. I recommend that particular slide, that summary slide, which is number, can't find it, whatever number it is. Need to put numbers on slides. If we can, if you want to paste that up on your wall and redo your story in terms of that narrative. By the way, the same applies to emails, presentations. You can use that in all manner of different places. Situation, the issues that creates, i.e. the pain points that creates, the ripple effects of those, because it's the ripple effects of those that's really interesting. I did a coaching call this morning where ripple effects was the key theme. The crucial shift that you want to bring about, the shift of approach, if you like, as Christine's just described it. And exactly as you've just said, Christine, gaining an insightful perspective. That's precisely what we're after. Yep, as Edward pointed out, it helps to hear the question behind the question. It does. And then you can tell a story as indeed that's it. We're not talking here about becoming invisible. On the contrary, we're talking about making value visible. This applies within a team as much as it applies in the wider world with clients. Much of the value we have is like the iceberg. 80% of it is under the water. And a lot of it is, okay, a lot of it is caused by the inattention of other people. Of course it is. But it's also caused by our own self-preoccupation. With self-worth, we can shift from proving ourselves to valuing ourselves. And precisely as Magnus alluded to in the chat a few minutes ago, we can, but by being interested, we become interesting. Isn't Melanie far more interesting in her discussion of the challenges of people in career coaches than she is in talking about her degree in psychology and her trip to India and her 7 years experience with a telecommunications company? You know, all these things, you know, don't tend to highlight the value that we bring to others. Beautifully put by Edgar Friedenberg many years ago, a quote that's also in the book. What's important is how we are valuable rather than how valuable we are. I've been using that quote for quite a few years. In fact, I first met Magnus at a coaching conference at least 10 years ago. It was probably closer to 15. And we talked about this quotation. What I didn't appreciate back then, Magnus, is the significance of self-worth in actually enabling that shift to be made. It puzzled me for a long time why people struggle with this. At various points, I thought it was courage, I thought it was skill, I thought it was many different things. Culture. I now understand why it's because that emptiness inside is like a black hole. And when people are craving validation, their own validation, i.e., when they're still on the drug of self-esteem, it's very hard for them to make the shift from how valuable we are to how is it that we're valuable. I wish I'd known that a decade earlier. Let's take another example. Different place, different environment. Let's leave Melanie to her newfound script and hope she comes back with another perspective. If there's any real Melanies that would like to be on the next call, we're game. In fact, there's a video coming up with a very courageous lady called Leah, which is pretty much on the same theme. It's that shift. I'm very happy to do coaching sessions with anyone, even in a hot seat video environment, on this shift, because it's one that's very powerful and it makes quite a difference to how people live their lives. By the way, on that, there'll be a link at the end, or even now, if you wanted, talktojohnnyland.com has my diary on it. If you want to practice some of that for yourself, just slot yourself in. Let's take a different example. Yes, good point, Terry. Would I change the book, The Courage to Ask, with self-worth insights? Yes, I would. I've learned self-worth. The Courage to Ask was written in 2012. At that point, I thought it was primarily about courage. Today, I know that there are roots to that problem. This book is the layer below The Courage to Ask. It's the dialogue we have with ourselves. Courage is very much about the dialogue we're willing to, well, the courage to ask was about the dialogue we're willing to have with others. Today I have an appreciation of why people struggle to implement some of the things in the courage to ask. Perceptive question, thank you. Let's take a different environment. We're 45 minutes in. Suppose you've been on the receiving end of some difficult feedback. We did a workshop here in Lisbon on giving difficult feedback, nonviolent communication, Marshall Rosenberg, many of you know. But we don't always focus on what it's like to receive difficult feedback. And this could be after an interview, this could be a management appraisal that is maybe surprising or negative, as the case may be. Could be a relationship conversation where we've been on the receiving end of feedback, whether that was given according to Marshall Rosenberg's rules or not. And none of these are, it could be a friendship conversation, none of these are easy conversations. And the after effects of some of these conversations can be not so easy as well. But wow, those after effects can be massively magnified if self-worth is low. What do you think might happen? What are the risks on the receiving end of one of these conversations if self-worth is low? What impact is that likely to have? Depression, absolutely. For many people, taking things personally results in demoralization, results in a negative view or defensiveness. Yep, here we go. Wow, they're cascading in now. Notice the ripples, by the way. Wow, here come the ripples. Can't hear it, won't hear it. Drop in self-esteem, indeed. Particularly if the criticism is justified. I mean, if it's unjustified, we make it angry or defensive. But if the criticism is justified, we may slump into a drop in self-esteem. which results in the self-blaming, which results in us creating, as Antonina has referred to, even higher expectations of ourselves. So we get into this vicious cycle of the gap gets bigger, if you like. Wow, God, there's some of these I hadn't even thought about. Being isolated, Malcolm. Yeah, that's a point. And whether we should or shouldn't is irrelevant. Feelings do not tend to respond to shoulds and shouldn't. So if self-worth is low, even when we know better, we will find ourselves sometimes in self-reproach. In fact, I find that in situations where I should know better, my self-reproach is even worse, because then I blame myself for how I'm reacting. So there's a whole vicious cycle sets in. Now, I don't want to get you all depressed, so we better move on. I don't have enough Xanax in this call to serve out to all of you. So with self-worth, we can do things a little bit differently. We can, first of all, distinguish opinion from reality. Anyone else's opinion of us, even the boss, is just opinion. It's not reality. So with self-worth, we get clearer about opinions and realities. Not the same thing. Stories are not facts. We can, even if our behavior is being criticized, as it might be in a relationship, there's a distinction between our behavior and ourselves. So we can at least draw a distinction that allows us to not feel personally attacked. With that clarity, we can have a dispassionate look at whatever truth there may be, and even if it's not the truth, maybe it's a truth. Maybe there is a truth in the other person's viewpoint that we have not thought about. And even if that's not the full picture, we can at least accord and acknowledge the truth that might lie in the other person's viewpoint. I mean, even when people are wrong, they're rarely completely wrong. There's normally some grain of truth in whatever impression or story they're telling about us, even if we don't like the way they're telling it. And therefore, hopefully, as a result of the above, we can at least avoid the blaming self-justification, which never works. I mean, try it. You know, have you ever been in a situation where you did some self-justification and the other person went, "Oh, you're absolutely right. I was totally wrong." You know, that it just doesn't work. It does, however, mean you don't have to agree with the other person. You can disagree with them courteously. Self-worth allows you to disagree. Self-worth isn't about going around agreeing with everyone and making them right. On the contrary, self-worth allows us to say, well, I hear you, but I don't agree with you. And even if self-esteem is impacted, and it can be, despite all of the good points above, there will still be situations where we go, really is disappointing. Think love, you know, that's everything can follow the script, but you'll still feel. You can recover quickly even when your self-esteem is impacted, because it's precisely then you have a new place to hold on to. You have your roots now go down to self-worth, which is below the frost line, if you like. So when you're loyal to your own identity and vision, this allows you to recover quickly, and as a result, it inspires trust with other people. Somehow people pick up on it. I don't know how. I love to know how. Any thoughts on the above is very welcome. But it's uncanny to me how when your roots are genuinely, when you're being loyal to your values and your vision, somehow people pick up on this. Okay, I appreciate that a webinar like this throws up many different issues. Some will to do with insecurity, anxiety, uncertainty, particularly in today's environment. Some are, I know, preparing for negotiation, or should be, because if you have a key negotiation coming up in, you know, March or June of this year, you need to be doing the value-based conversations now, not on the evening of the negotiation. For many people, it's how to present themselves with more impact. One of the things that's not really on that list is career transition. I had a very interesting conversation yesterday with somebody who was rethinking her career. And one of the fascinating things about a self-worth approach rather than a self-esteem approach is that it's very empowering during transition. or it's very empowering for a young professional who perhaps has not yet got their toehold in the world of employment at all. The good news here is we're not restricted to our own experience. That revised version of Melanie's pitch or Melanie's story can be done even if the examples she's drawing on are not her own, do not lie in her own experience. So it's very liberating. All we need is a spirit of curiosity in order to navigate transition. And if we can keep rooted in our own sense of self-worth while we're on that navigation, that becomes a very empowering time. Of course, for anyone in business development, as you know, I've been working with people on business development for 18 years, even longer. No surprise here. You know about this already, because one great thing about business development is it's a crash course in personal development. Because you get to run the gauntlet of dealing with rejection and resilience and all the other things to a degree that, you know, whether you want it or not is irrelevant. So for any of these reasons, if you'd like to avail of a 30-minute call to explore, then pop onto talktojohnnyland.com, which hopefully has my diary on it. At least it did yesterday. We did have a security problem on that a week ago, so I'm hoping it's fixed. It looked okay yesterday. Feel free to log in there and book yourself in. It will probably be in February. It might even be later February, depending on who gets there first. But feel free to do so. And for some of the people I've known for many years who are on today's call, even if you want to just make that a catch-up call, I'd be delighted to have 30 minutes with you. Hi, Magnus. Dates for your diary. February the 27th is the next webinar. We've changed the plan here thanks to a discussion that happened in that kitchen a few weeks ago, which is, it's a follow-on to today. It's how you introduce yourself with more impact, with self-worth. We have a whole series of human space events that just is evolving so fast we can't even keep the website up to date. In Brussels, there's an event on the 4th of April. So if you're anywhere near Brussels, please put 4th of April in the diary. Evening, things will follow. In London, March the 12th, again, haven't had time to put it on the diary yet, but there's a human space event on March the 12th. We now have 8 cities who have active or budding human space groups. There's a plan for a meeting in Sao Paulo on Monday. We're also looking at a roundup, a global get-together in Brussels in September. Haven't even had time to tell Isabel about that yet. And finally, as you'll see from the list, there is a self-worth coaching course. So this is literally a course in coaching or facilitation for those who want to work with others on self-worth rather than just confirming their struggle with self-esteem. There's a 1-week course of that for people who want to be licensed in the self-worth safari approach from November the 3rd to November the 10th here in Portugal. Again, details to follow on that. If you want to be kept abreast of any of these things, just ping us an email after the call and we will let you know. If you are available and interested in starting a human space group in any city, particularly looking at cities in France and the USA at the moment. We have Zagreb in Croatia, we have Prague, Berlin, London, Lisbon, Brussels, who have I missed, The Hague. But we are particularly keen to hear from people who are based in France or people who are based in the USA. So if you have friends there whom you think might like to tap into this, the human space, as Terry has just asked, is about creating a space for human-to-human connection where self-worth is fostered and where it grows. So it's people who are interested in this topic, who like to share their gifts and their talents with each other, and who just like hanging out with other humans who get this stuff, who have a growth mindset, who actually are interested in connecting with others. One of the comments in London last week was, I'm just not meeting enough people like you lot. Somebody who's very much involved in the technical space and who wants to actually have different types of conversations. So human space, exactly as it says on the tin, is where humans, the phrase used in Brussels yesterday by a group of people who met to discuss this further was the guardians of humanity. So it's not just about being networking or meeting each other with masks. It's actually about putting down the masks and meeting and working and collaborating, as is already happening, in human-friendly ways. So, if any of that is of interest, thanks, Gael. And if you want to join a group, ping us an email, let us know which city you're in, and we'll match you up with the gang that's nearest to you. And it's not just making business connections, Terry. There's lots of making business connections out there, but in practice, that happens anyway. Because when people get to know each other as human beings, the business connections follow. But it's not another BNI, it's not another breakfast club, it's not another strategic alliance partner group or whatever it might be. Thanks, Kerry. Yeah, I'm not sure I want to, but I hear where you're going with that. The idea is to connect people on a people-to-people basis. Okay, I think that's about it. No, keep that B word out of that chat box. No, we're not going there. We're not going there. We are, however, all very aware of the uncertainty that's around everywhere, and not just in B. And human-to-human connection is particularly vital during times of uncertainty. There's no accident that the countries I've just mentioned are all going through their own version of uncertainty. It's precisely during times of uncertainty that human-to-human connection becomes really valuable. That's what got people through the Blitz in generations gone by, where people connect with other people and start valuing each other and valuing their work. Okay, thanks everyone. Book will be out in March. Details will follow. There'll be a pre-order link probably sent to you at some stage for those who are interested. Thanks everyone for your feedback and participation. And if there's any aspect of the Self-Worth Academy work that you want to connect with, we're keen to support you with that. Have a good day and see you on February 27th. Bye for now. Where is it? I know there's an end webinar button. Question is where it is. Do everything except end the webinar. End webinar. Click.